The Lost City Beneath the Ice. The expedition begins. The Arctic wind howled like a banshee, cutting through the thick layers of thermal clothing worn by Dr. Evelyn Carter and her team. The icy expanse stretched endlessly in every direction, a desolate wasteland of white and blue. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the frozen terrain. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the very air felt ancient and heavy with secrets. Evelyn adjusted her goggles and glanced at the GPS device strapped to her wrist. The coordinates were correct. This was the place. For years, she had been obsessed with the idea of a lost city buried beneath the ice. A city that had been whispered about in ancient texts and dismissed as myth by modern scholars. But Evelyn had always believed in the power of myth, in the grains of truth hidden within the stories passed down through generations. The team had been traveling for weeks, braving the harsh conditions of the Arctic, following a trail of clues that had led them to this remote location. They had uncovered fragments of an ancient map, pieced together from various sources, that pointed to the existence of a city buried beneath the ice. The map was old, so old that the ink had faded and the parchment had become brittle, but the details were unmistakable. There was something here, something that had been hidden for centuries. Evelyn's heart raced as she surveyed the area. The ice was thick here, but beneath it, she could see the faint outlines of structures, like the bones of some long-dead beast. The team had brought with them the latest in ground-penetrating radar technology, and they had already begun to scan the area. The results were astonishing. The radar images showed a vast network of tunnels and chambers, a city frozen in time. "Dr. Carter, you need to see this," called out Dr. Marcus Lee, the team's geologist. He was crouched over the radar screen, his face pale with excitement. Evelyn hurried over, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the images. The city was massive, far larger than she had ever imagined. The tunnels and chambers were arranged in a complex pattern, like the veins of some enormous creature. And at the center of it all was a large, circular structure, like a temple or a palace. "We need to get down there," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with anticipation. "We need to see what's inside." The team worked quickly, setting up the drilling equipment. The ice was thick, but the drill was powerful, and it wasn't long before they had broken through. The hole was just wide enough for a person to fit through, and Evelyn was the first to descend. She lowered herself down into the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. The air inside the tunnel was cold and still, and the walls were smooth, as if they had been carved by some ancient hand. Evelyn switched on her headlamp, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The tunnel stretched out before her, disappearing into the shadows. She could feel the weight of the ice above her, pressing down on the city like a tomb. As she moved deeper into the tunnel, she began to notice strange markings on the walls. They were symbols, carved into the ice, and they seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. Evelyn reached out to touch one of the symbols, and a shiver ran down her spine. The ice was cold, but the symbol felt warm, as if it was alive. "Dr. Carter, are you seeing this?" Marcus's voice crackled over the radio. Evelyn nodded, even though she knew he couldn't see her. "Yes," she replied. "It's incredible. These symbols. They're like nothing I've ever seen before." The team continued to explore the tunnels, their excitement growing with each new discovery. The city was a labyrinth, a maze of tunnels and chambers that seemed to go on forever. But as they moved deeper, they began to notice something strange. The air was getting colder, and the symbols on the walls were becoming more frequent, more intense. And then they found the first body. It was frozen in the ice, perfectly preserved. The figure was humanoid, but it was not human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were large and black, like the eyes of a deep-sea creature. Its mouth was open in a silent scream, and its hands were clawed, as if it had been trying to escape something. "No," she said. "We need to understand what this is. We need to know why the city was buried, why these creatures were left here." But as she reached out to touch the crystal, the figure's eyes snapped open, and Evelyn felt a wave of terror wash over her. The creature's eyes were black, like the void of space, and they seemed to pierce through her, into her very soul. And then, the ground beneath her feet began to shake, and the walls of the chamber began to crack. The symbols on the walls flared with a blinding light, and Evelyn realized, too late, that they had awakened something that should have remained buried. "Run!" she screamed, but it was already too late. The ice above them began to collapse, and the city began to crumble around them. Evelyn turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest, but she could feel the creature's eyes on her, watching her, following her. As she reached the surface, she turned back to look at the city one last time. The ice was collapsing, and the city was being swallowed by the darkness. But as she watched, she saw something move in the shadows, something large and terrible, something that had been waiting for centuries to be free. And then, the ice closed over the city, and it was gone, buried once more beneath the frozen wasteland. But Evelyn knew that it was not the end. The city was still there, waiting, and the creature was still alive, trapped in the ice, waiting for the day when it would be free once more. The awakening. The helicopter blades thrummed loudly as it ascended, carrying Evelyn and her team away from the collapsing ice. The wind whipped through the open door, biting at their faces, but Evelyn barely noticed. Her mind was still reeling from what they had just witnessed. The city, the creature, the symbols, it was all too much to process. She clutched the small crystal shard she had managed to grab before fleeing, its eerie light pulsating faintly in her hand. "Dr. Carter, are you okay?" Marcus shouted over the noise, his face pale and drawn. Evelyn nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. She could still feel the creature's gaze, those black, void-like eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. "We need to analyze this," she said, holding up the crystal shard. "There's something about it, something important." The team returned to their base camp, a small research station on the edge of the Arctic Circle. The station was equipped with state-of-the-art technology, but it felt woefully inadequate compared to the ancient, alien machinery they had just encountered. Evelyn immediately set to work, examining the crystal shard under a microscope. The symbols on its surface were intricate, almost hypnotic, and they seemed to shift and change as she watched. "What do you think it is?" Marcus asked, peering over her shoulder. "I don't know," Evelyn admitted, "but it's not of this world. The symbols, they're a language but not one I've ever seen before." As the hours passed, the team worked tirelessly, trying to decipher the symbols and understand the nature of the crystal. But the more they studied it, the more questions they had. The crystal seemed to emit a faint, otherworldly energy, and the symbols appeared to be some kind of code, a message from a civilization long gone. And then, something strange began to happen. The crystal started to hum, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire station. The symbols on its surface began to glow brighter, and the air around it grew colder. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that the crystal was reacting to something. "Dr. Carter, look at this," one of the technicians called out. He was monitoring the seismic sensors they had set up around the camp, and the readings were off the charts. The ground was shaking, not just in the immediate area. Evelyn didn't answer. She was too focused on the crystal, which was now glowing so brightly that it was almost blinding. The symbols on its surface were moving, shifting, as if they were alive. And then, with a sudden, deafening crack, the crystal shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. The team ducked for cover, but when they looked up, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The shards of the crystal were floating in midair, spinning and twisting as if guided by some unseen force. And then they began to reassemble themselves, forming a new shape, a new structure. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. Evelyn didn't know. The new structure was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was a sphere, perfectly smooth and glowing with the same eerie light as the symbols. And as it floated there, spinning slowly, it began to emit a sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. And then the sphere began to change. It expanded, growing larger and larger until it filled the entire room. The team backed away, their eyes wide with fear, as the sphere began to pulse with light, each pulse sending a wave of energy through the station. "Get down!" Evelyn shouted, but it was too late. The sphere exploded in a burst of light, sending a shockwave through the station. The walls shook, the equipment was thrown to the ground, and the team was knocked off their feet. When the light finally faded, the team was left in stunned silence. The sphere was gone, but in its place was something even more terrifying. The walls of the station were covered in the same symbols they had seen in the city, and the air was filled with a low, ominous hum. What just happened?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn didn't answer. She was too busy staring at the walls, at the symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She could feel it, a presence, something ancient and powerful, something that had been awakened by the crystal. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "Now." The team didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed what equipment they could and made a run for the door. But as they stepped outside, they realized that the world had changed. The sky was dark, filled with swirling clouds that seemed to pulse with the same eerie light as the symbols. The ground was shaking, and in the distance, they could see the ice cracking, splitting apart as if something massive was rising from beneath the surface. "Dr. Carter, what's happening?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with panic. Evelyn didn't know, but as she looked out at the horizon, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The ice was breaking apart, and rising from the depths was the city, the lost city they had uncovered. But it was different now. The structures were glowing, pulsing with the same light as the symbols, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum. And then she saw it. The creature, the one they had awakened, was standing at the edge of the city, its black, void-like eyes staring directly at her. It was free, and it was coming for them. "Run!" Evelyn screamed, but it was already too late. The creature moved with unnatural speed, crossing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. The team scattered, but the creature was relentless, its claws slashing through the air with deadly precision. Evelyn ran, her heart pounding in her chest, but she could feel the creature's presence behind her, closing in. She could hear its breath, low and guttural, and she could feel its eyes on her, watching her, waiting. And then, she tripped, falling to the ground. She turned, expecting to see the creature looming over her, but instead, she saw something else. The symbols on the walls of the station were glowing brighter, and the air was filled with a strange, otherworldly energy. The creature hesitated, its black eyes narrowing as it stared at the symbols. Evelyn didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to act. She grabbed a piece of equipment from the ground, a small device that emitted a high-pitched frequency, and turned it on. The sound was deafening, and the creature recoiled, its claws covering its ears. "Now!" Evelyn shouted, and the team sprang into action. They grabbed whatever they could find, using the equipment to create a barrier of sound and light around the creature. It roared in anger, but it was trapped, unable to move. "Dr. Carter, what do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with panic. Evelyn didn't know, but as she looked at the creature, at its black, void-like eyes, she realized that they had awakened something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The city, the symbols, the creature. It was all connected, and they had only just begun to understand the true nature of what they had uncovered. "We need to find a way to stop it," she said, her voice trembling, "before it's too late." But as she spoke, the ground beneath them began to shake, and the sky above them grew darker. The creature roared, its voice echoing across the frozen wasteland, and Evelyn knew that they were running out of time. The lost city had awakened, and with it, something ancient and terrible. And now it was coming for them, the descent into darkness. The team regrouped at the edge of the research station, their breaths visible in the frigid air. The creature was still trapped within the barrier of sound and light, but its roars were growing more intense, more desperate. The ground continued to shake, and the sky above was a swirling maelstrom of dark clouds and eerie light. Evelyn clutched the small device in her hand, the one that had saved them from the creature's initial attack. "We need to find a way to contain it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "If we can't stop it, it's going to break free." Marcus nodded, his face pale but determined. "What do you suggest? We can't keep this up forever." Evelyn glanced back at the station, her mind racing. The symbols on the walls were still glowing, and the air was... But then, the sphere began to emit a bright, blinding light, and the creature was pulled towards it, its form twisting and contorting as it was drawn into the sphere. The team watched in stunned silence as the creature was absorbed, its form disappearing into the light. The sphere pulsed once, twice, and then went dark, falling to the ground with a soft thud. Evelyn picked it up, her hands trembling. "It worked," she whispered, though she couldn't quite believe it. But their relief was short-lived. The ground beneath them began to shake again, and the sky above grew darker. The city, the lost city they had uncovered, was still rising from the ice, its structures glowing with an eerie light. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, his voice filled with urgency, "before the city fully emerges." Evelyn nodded, but as she turned to leave, she felt a strange pull, a compulsion to go back. The city was calling to her, its presence overwhelming. She knew it was dangerous, but she also knew that they couldn't just leave. There were answers in that city, answers they needed if they were going to understand what had happened. "Marcus, take the team and get to safety," she said, her voice firm. "I need to go back." "Are you crazy?" Marcus exclaimed. "You saw what happened. That thing almost killed us." "I know," Evelyn replied. "But there's something in that city, something we need to understand. If we don't, this isn't over. That creature was just the beginning." Marcus stared at her for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," he said, "and don't do anything stupid." Evelyn gave him a small smile, then turned and headed back towards the city. The ground was still shaking, and the air was thick with an otherworldly energy. The city was fully emerging now, its structures rising from the ice like the bones of some ancient beast. As she approached the central chamber, the one they had found earlier, she felt a wave of dread wash over her. The symbols on the walls were glowing brighter, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum. She could feel the presence of the city, ancient and powerful, and it was overwhelming. But she pressed on, driven by a need to understand, to uncover the truth. The central chamber was just as they had left it, the large, circular platform in the center still glowing with an eerie light. The figure encased in crystal was gone, but the platform was still there, pulsing with energy. Evelyn approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the power emanating from it, a power that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the surface of the platform, and suddenly, she was overwhelmed by a flood of images, of memories that were not her own. She saw the city as it had been, centuries ago, a thriving metropolis filled with life. She saw the people, strange and alien, their skin pale and translucent, their eyes large and black. She saw the creature, the one they had awakened, but it was different then, not a monster but a guardian, a protector of the city. And then she saw the end. The city was under attack, besieged by an enemy that was not of this world. The people fought bravely, but they were outmatched. In a last, desperate act, they sealed the city beneath the ice, trapping themselves and their enemy in a frozen tomb. The images faded, and Evelyn was left standing in the chamber, her mind reeling. She understood now. The city had been buried to protect the world from the creature, from the enemy that had threatened to destroy everything. And now they had awakened it, unleashed it upon the world once more. Evelyn knew what she had to do. She had to seal the city again, trap the creature and its enemy beneath the ice once more. But to do that, she would need to activate the platform, to use the power of the city to seal it away. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the platform, feeling the energy coursing through her. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum. The ground began to shake, and the city started to descend, the ice closing over it once more. But as the city began to sink, Evelyn felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The power of the platform was too much, and she could feel it draining her, sapping her strength. She knew she couldn't hold on much longer. And then, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Marcus standing beside her, his face filled with determination. "You're not doing this alone," he said, his voice firm. Evelyn nodded, and together they activated the platform, using the power of the city to seal it away once more. The ground shook, and the ice closed over the city, burying it beneath the frozen wasteland. As the city disappeared, Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. The creature was trapped, the city was sealed, and the world was safe. But as she looked out at the horizon, she knew that it wasn't truly over. The city was still there, waiting, and the creature was still alive, trapped in the ice. And one day it would awaken again. But for now, they had bought the world some time. And that was enough. The aftermath. The Arctic was silent once more, the howling wind the only sound that broke the stillness. The research station stood as a lone sentinel on the icy expanse, its walls battered but still standing. Inside, the team was gathered in the main room, their faces drawn and weary. The events of the past few hours had left them all shaken, but they knew they couldn't afford to rest just yet. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, the small, dark sphere that had contained the creature resting in front of her. It was cold to the touch, its surface smooth and unyielding. The symbols that had once glowed with an eerie light were now dull and lifeless, but she could still feel a faint pulse of energy emanating from within. "We need to figure out what to do with this," she said, her voice low but steady. "We can't just leave it here. It's too dangerous." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the sphere. "Agreed. But what can we do? We don't even know what it is or how it works." Evelyn sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We need to study it, understand it, but we have to be careful. If we make a mistake, if we release that thing again." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The memory of the creature's black, void-like eyes was still fresh in their minds, and the thought of it breaking free was enough to send a shiver down their spines. The team worked through the night, analyzing the sphere and the fragments of the crystal they had managed to recover. The symbols on the sphere were unlike anything they had ever seen, a language that seemed to defy all known linguistic patterns. But Evelyn was determined to decipher it, to understand the message that had been left behind by the ancient civilization that had created it. As the hours passed, the team began to make progress. The symbols, they realized, were not just a language, but a code, a set of instructions that described the nature of the creature and the city it had come from. The creature, they learned, was not just a monster, but a weapon, a creation of the ancient civilization that had been used to defend their city from an enemy that had threatened to destroy them. But something had gone wrong. The creature had turned on its creators, becoming a force of destruction rather than protection. In a last, desperate act, the civilization had sealed the city beneath the ice, trapping the creature and its enemy in a frozen tomb. Evelyn felt a wave of sadness as she read the ancient texts. The civilization had been advanced, far beyond anything the modern world had ever seen. But they had been brought to ruin by their own creation, a weapon that had turned against them. "We need to destroy it," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't risk it getting loose again." Evelyn nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The sphere, the symbols, the city, it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle that they were only just beginning to understand. "We need to be sure," she said. "If we destroy it, we might be destroying something important, something that could help us understand what happened here." Marcus frowned, but he didn't argue. He knew Evelyn was right. They couldn't afford to make a mistake, not with something this dangerous. The team continued to work, piecing together the fragments of the ancient texts and trying to understand the nature of the sphere. But as they worked, they began to notice something strange. The sphere was changing, its surface becoming more opaque, the symbols fading away. "What's happening?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with concern. Evelyn shook her head. "I don't know, but it's like it's shutting down. The team watched in stunned silence as the sphere continued to change, its surface becoming darker and more solid. The energy that had once pulsed within it was gone, and the sphere was now just a cold, lifeless object. Evelyn reached out to touch it, but as her fingers brushed against its surface, she felt a sudden, sharp pain. She pulled her hand back, her eyes wide with shock. The sphere was no longer just a container. It was a trap, a prison designed to hold the creature and its enemy for eternity. "We need to bury it," she said, her voice trembling. Evelyn had returned to her university, where she had resumed her teaching duties. But her lectures on ancient civilizations now carried a weight they hadn't before, a sense of urgency and importance that she couldn't quite shake. She found herself spending long hours in the university's archives, poring over ancient texts and maps, searching for any mention of the lost city, the creature, or the civilization that had created it. But the more she searched, the more she realized how little she knew. The city, the creature, the symbols, they were all part of a story that had been lost to time, a story that had been buried beneath the ice for centuries. And now, it was buried once more. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly gone. She had tried to bury the memories of the city, of the creature, but now they were coming back, stronger than ever. She knew that Marcus was right. The sphere, the city, the creature, they were all connected, and they were all still out there, waiting. "We need to go back," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to find out what's happening." Evelyn nodded, though the thought of returning to the Arctic filled her with a sense of dread. But she knew that they couldn't ignore this, couldn't pretend that it wasn't happening. The city, the creature, the symbols, they were all part of a story that wasn't finished, and they needed to see it through. The team regrouped, their faces drawn and weary but filled with determination. They knew that this was their last chance, their final opportunity to uncover the truth and put an end to the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. The journey back to the Arctic was long and arduous, but they pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency that refused to be ignored. As they approached the site where the city had emerged, they could feel the air growing colder, the sky darker. The ice was still cracked and broken, but the city itself was gone, buried once more beneath the frozen wasteland. But as they set up their equipment and began to scan the area, they realized that something was different. It was deep beneath the ice, but they could still feel its presence, its energy pulsing through the frozen ground. As they began to drill, the ground beneath them began to shake, and the sky above grew darker. The symbols on the walls of the city were glowing brighter, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum. And then they found it. The sphere was just as they had left it, cold and lifeless, but as they approached it, they could feel the energy emanating from within. It was alive and it was growing stronger. Evelyn reached out to touch it, but as her fingers brushed against its surface, she felt a sudden, sharp pain. She pulled her hand back, her eyes wide with shock. The sphere was no longer just a container. It was a prison, a trap designed to hold the creature and its enemy for eternity. "We need to destroy it," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't risk it getting loose again." Evelyn nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The sphere, the symbols, the city, it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle that they were only just beginning to understand. But they didn't have time to think about it. The ground was shaking, and the sky was growing darker. The creature was awakening, and they needed to act fast. The team worked together, using their equipment to create a powerful explosive that would destroy the sphere and the creature within it. It was a risky plan, but they knew it was their only chance. As they set the explosive and prepared to detonate it, Evelyn felt a wave of sadness wash over her. The city, the civilization, the creature, they were all part of a story that had been lost to time, and now they were being destroyed once more. But as she looked out at the horizon, she knew that it was the right thing to do. The city, the creature, the symbols, they were all part of a nightmare that needed to be put to rest. The explosive detonated with a deafening roar, sending a shockwave through the ice. The ground shook, and the sky was filled with a blinding light. And then it was over. The city was gone, buried once more beneath the ice. The creature was destroyed, its presence erased from the world. And the sphere, the symbol of the ancient civilization's power and downfall, was no more. Evelyn and her team stood in silence, their faces drawn and weary, but filled with a sense of relief. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. But as they turned to leave, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly the end. The city, the creature, the symbols, they were all part of a story that had been lost to time, and now it was buried once more. But the legacy of the lost city would live on, in the memories of those who had uncovered its secrets, and in the knowledge that some mysteries were better left buried. And as Evelyn looked out at the horizon, she knew that the world was safe, for now. But she also knew that the city, the creature, the symbols, they were all still out there, waiting buried beneath the ice. And one day they would awaken again,